Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 13 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses thus far this season on average are allowing the most fantasy points to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 13. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. If you're looking for a specific running back, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, help us reach our goal of 82,000 subscribers by subscribing today. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season, so be sure to go ahead and help us out with that. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, let's talk about some running back matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 running back rushing statistics allowed. Now, I've gone ahead and isolated the spectrum of time between weeks 5 through 12 because, again, the first month of the season, these teams were completely different. But over the course of weeks 5 through 12, we have found that the Arizona Cardinals, Carolina Panthers, New York Giants, etc., are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics isolated. The reason why I go ahead and isolate rushing yards and rushing touchdowns is because regardless of what scoring format you play in, standard, half PPR, full PPR, you can take advantage of the overall matchups and advantageous nature of them. Now, I'll go ahead and I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video, but keep in mind there are some disadvantageous matchups that we might want to be careful with. Again, the Jacksonville Jaguars, Chicago Bears, Atlanta Falcons, they played extremely well against opposing running backs. All three of these teams allowing fewer than 4 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs since week 5. So Joe Mixon taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, despite coming off a lackluster performance, we may end up having ourselves another dud performance from him based on the overall matchup on hand. We're hopefully not going to see that, but just keep in mind these matchups definitely do play a factor when the 11 other defenders are certainly trying to use their efforts to stop our fantasy prospects from finding success. Okay, now that we've covered all this, let's transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings. But keep in mind, rankings are always subject to change. Like prior to the recording of this video, I was given news that Jonathan Taylor is going to be out for 2 to 3 weeks. Zack Moss is the thumbnail of today's episode for a reason, because he's immediately going to be a huge potential option for many of our fantasy teams. Hopefully he's available on your waivers. Potentially he's on your bench as a handcuff. This is exactly why yesterday throughout our waiver wire episode, when I talked about running backs, it was all about, hey, get the handcuff of your most valuable running back, because certainly that is going to play a factor within the fantasy football playoffs. Nonetheless, keep in mind that if in fact you're trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, you can go ahead and swing on by Sunday morning, or you can go ahead and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, you'll get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR. All you got to do is make a first-time deposit minimum of $10 using code Andrew and be eligible based on the location on the right side of the screen. So take advantage of the opportunity, and if you do so before Thursday's game between the Dallas Cowboys and Seattle Seahawks, you can take advantage of 0.5 total yards from Dak Prescott going into this week. Thank you very much. Okay, let's talk about our number one running back, beginning with Christian McCaffrey. As we all know, Christian McCaffrey, the best running back in fantasy football, coming off another incredible performance of 28.4 half PPR fantasy points. He has scored 30 touchdowns in the last 25 games as a San Francisco 49er. That's regular season and postseason. Nonetheless, they take on the Philadelphia Eagles this week. It is more of a disadvantageous matchup, but as we have seen, they're giving up a pretty good share of yards per attempt, over 4 yards per carry. My anticipation is that Christian McCaffrey should be able to ball out once again. He's coming off a 4 consecutive game streak of 5+ receptions. And this is a little bit of a revenge game for what happened in the NFC Championship game. I'm sure the San Francisco 49ers definitely want to prove to the Philadelphia Eagles that they should have won that game and went to the Super Bowl. Moving on to our number 2. We have Travis Etienne. So Travis Etienne continues to get himself a lot of opportunity. In fact, he's coming off a week in which he had 20 rushing attempts and 4 receptions, 24 total touches. We can't really complain with that, even though he only got 10.6 fantasy points. Unfortunately, Trevor Lawrence, QB sneak on the 1-yard line for a touchdown. Last week I said that Trevor Lawrence scoring rushing touchdowns was going to be a rare instance. Unfortunately, that wasn't a rare instance. It happened for a second consecutive week. Hopefully going against the Cincinnati Bengals, the 7th most advantageous matchup at the running back position, a defense that is allowing over 15 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs since week 5, 4.55 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. I would hope that Travis Etienne can not only find the end zone, but be far more efficient. In Sunday's game against the Houston Texans, 20 carries for 56 rushing yards. I think he'll be far more efficient. Amongst all running backs in the National Football League right now, he's number 3 in terms of attempts per game on average. He's going to have the opportunity. He just needs to fall into the end zone to find himself a great overall performance. Our number 3 is Bijan Robinson. Bijan Robinson has been playing extremely well, but when you look at weeks 8 and 9, Bijan Robinson only had 22 rushing attempts throughout those 2 games. His 2 most recent games, weeks 10 and 12, have led to 38 rushing attempts. His overall increase in opportunity is certainly impactful in terms of his overall fantasy success. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, he's been able to surpass, 18 plus fantasy points on both overall occasions, is getting workhorse level of opportunity, not only on the ground, but through the air. Had himself a rushing touchdown last week and had himself 3 catches, 32 yards, and a receiving touchdown. As long as the opportunity is there, especially down in the red zone, which will continue to be the case with Desmond Ridder as their starting quarterback, my expectation taking on the New York Jets, the 12th best matchup at the running back position, a defense that is allowing 4.1 yards per carry and nearly 14 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics. Bijan Robinson, absolutely an S-tier prospect going into week 13. Number 4, we have the thumbnail of today's episode. We have Zack Moss. Hopefully you've gone ahead and you've handcuffed Jonathan Taylor. But as we know, Jonathan Taylor is going to be out for the next 2 to 3 weeks with that thumb surgery that obviously took place earlier today. Now, for those of us who have Zack Moss on roster and had him early in the season, especially from weeks 2 through 4, without Jonathan Taylor in the lineup, we remember, he was averaging 22 rushing attempts per game, 93 rushing yards per game, 2 receptions per game, 14 receiving yards per game, and scored a touchdown in 2 of the 3 games. He was the lone starter in this backfield, averaging 16.4 half PPR fantasy points per game. The last time he took on the Tennessee Titans, who he has the privilege of taking on this week, back in week 5, he had himself 23 rushing attempts, 165, 2 touchdowns, 2 receptions, 30 receiving yards, 32.5 fantasy points in that matchup. It was the first week back for Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor wasn't utilized much, so it was all Zack Moss, and he dominated. The Tennessee Titans, since week 5, with that performance involved, are the 8th best matchup, allowing over 4 yards per carry and nearly 15 fantasy points per game. Zack Moss absolutely should be a fantastic play going into this week. Our number 5 for this week is Alvin Kamara. The primary reason why I have Alvin Kamara in this conversation, besides the fact that in 6 of the last 6 games, he has had 4+ receptions. He's getting it done on the ground through the air. Unfortunately, was not able to score a touchdown this last week, but going into this week against the Detroit Lions, a pretty good run-stopping defense. My anticipation with Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, and Michael Thomas all dealing with injuries. Chris Olave, obviously the concussion protocol. Michael Thomas on the injured reserve. Rashid Shaheed dealing with a quad, thigh, hamstring, something of that extent injury. Not exactly sure what the details are. They'll release that as soon as we get the injury report on Wednesday. But as of right now, with all those receivers injured, and you have guys like A.T. Perry or potentially, Keith Kirkwood on the outside, this may be a game in which Alvin Kamara does, one of those big performances of 10+ receptions, or maybe even gets himself 15 receptions like we saw earlier this season. There is a lot of potential for that and a lot of checkdowns going in his direction, especially in a matchup in which they should be in a negative game script. I'm expecting a lot of receiving work from Alvin Kamara this week. And on top of it, always has an opportunity of rushing upside in terms of scoring a touchdown within this offense. On number 6 is Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard in each of the last 2 games has finally begun a streak of scoring touchdowns. 13 carries for 79 and a rushing touchdown. I mean, in back-to-back weeks, both of his touchdowns have not even been near the goal line. Both opportunities have been, runs up the middle for sure, but they haven't been near the goal line. Anytime that I've gone ahead and I've watched Tony Pollard near the goal line over this entire season, his offensive line falls apart very quickly. They really haven't helped him in a lot of those scenarios. So luckily, he's been able to score touchdowns outside of the goal line conversation. He takes on the Seattle Seahawks on Thursday night. This matchup is the 4th best at the running back position. They're nearly allowing 5 yards per carry, 4.99 since week 5. They're allowing over 16.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics isolated. On top of the fact that Tony Pollard not only is getting rushing opportunity, but had himself 6 targets, 6 receptions, 24 receiving yards against the Washington Commanders last Thursday. After the bye week, the Dallas Cowboys have been a completely different offense. As a team, they are scoring 43, 23, 49, 33, and 45 points. They're blowing out teams. It could very easily take place once again, but as long as this team continues to score at a high volume, Tony Pollard will always be in line for potential touchdown upside. Our number 7 for this week is Kyren Williams. Kyren Williams was unbelievable on Sunday. Who would have guessed that he would have had himself 2 receiving touchdowns within their overall performance? We knew that he was going to be the primary receiving back, considering they sent, Darrell Henderson back to the practice squad and Royce Freeman was still active. 6 catches, 61 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, on top of the fact that he annihilated that run-stop defense of the Arizona Cardinals, which again is one of the best matchups at the position. 16 carries for 143. Could have very easily had himself a 3rd touchdown, but they gave it to Royce Freeman within one of those final drives. Nonetheless, over the course of this season, the fantasy finishes in a half PPR for Kyren Williams are 8, 4, 26, 3, 29, 2, and 1. He's averaging 20 fantasy points per game and takes on a pretty advantageous matchup with the Cleveland Browns. Besides the fact that they're going to be playing at home, Myles Garrett also dealing with an injury, and the fact that the Cleveland Browns secondary is elite. The Cleveland Browns secondary thus far this season have allowed the fewest passing yards per game amongst all teams. So my expectation going into this week against the defense that is the 9th best matchup at the running back position, allowing 4.76 yards per carry on average, nearly 15 fantasy points per game, is that Kyren Williams will continue to extend his overall success and for our fantasy teams elevate it to the next level. Moving on to our number 8, we have Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler has been very lackluster in terms of his overall efficiency. It's really down this season in comparison to seasons past. But nonetheless, he will continue to always have opportunities of scoring 20 plus fantasy points within a week. And even though we've seen a lot of inconsistencies in regards to those overall potential performances, you got to take into account that just this last week against the Baltimore Ravens, sure, it was a very difficult matchup, but they were down in the red zone. But instead of giving the ball to a guy like Austin Ekeler inside the 5-yard line, they end up making a pass to Gerald Everett. Nonetheless, Austin Ekeler will be given the opportunity, and hopefully Kellen Moore, taking on a Bill Belichick defense, will put up a similar performance, similar to the last time they took each other on. Back in 2021, when Kellen Moore was the offensive coordinator of the Dallas Cowboys, they put up a sweet number on this New England Patriots defense. So my hope is that Kellen Moore is very familiar with his Belichick defense, could have himself another big performance here for this Chargers offense, who definitely needs a win. It's win or pretty much this entire coaching staff is being cleared out. We're going to have to wait and see, but hopefully Austin Ekeler on the ground through the air can find himself touchdown upside. Our number 9 for this week, Rachaad White. Rachaad White has been playing extremely well. Besides the fact that he was late on the injury report last week on a Friday, popped up, and we were hoping that wasn't going to go ahead and hinder him. Had himself 15 carries for 100 rushing yards. Fantastic. Didn't have as much receiving utilization within the overall game, but hopefully going into this week, it's not going to matter in that circumstance either, considering they're taking on the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers are the second best matchup at the position, allowing 4.4 yards per carry and over 18 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. With unimpeded volume of opportunity going in the direction of Rachaad White on a weekly basis, guys like, Keyshawn Vaughn, Chase Edmonds, they're not competing for touches within this backfield. It is all Rachaad White all day. He's coming off a performance, the second time in his career in which he had over 100 rushing yards. We're hoping for another big performance this week against a division rival. Our number 10 for this week, we have David Montgomery. Regardless of what you think about David Montgomery, his overall touches, his lack of overall snaps, only played 27% of the overall snaps in Thursday's game against the Green Bay Packers. Obviously, because of the negative game script, they were down 20-6 early in that game. We still saw David Montgomery in his 27% of his snaps, 15 rushing attempts, 71 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown. In all 7 healthy games he has played this season, he has 1 rushing touchdown minimum. Even though Jahmyr Gibbs has had himself an expanded role over the course of the last 3 weeks, David Montgomery is still averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. These running backs are coexisting and playing extremely well. Since week 5, the New Orleans Saints are the 10th best matchup at the position, allowing 4.5 yards per carry and nearly 15 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. My expectation, a big week here for David Montgomery. On number 11, we have Derrick Henry. We're going to hope that Derrick Henry's overall opportunity share is going to continue to lean in this direction. Had himself 19 overall touches on Sunday against the Carolina Panthers, one of the more advantageous matchups. Obviously found himself in the end zone twice, but now they take on the Indianapolis Colts. Earlier this season in week 5, had himself a very lackluster performance within the overall game, but since week 5, the Indianapolis Colts have not been great in terms of stopping the run. They're the 5th best matchup. They're allowing 4.3 yards per carry, nearly 17 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I'm expecting week 13 to be another successful performance from Derrick Henry, finding the end zone, getting himself an ample share of opportunity, and of course, in terms of efficiency, should certainly be there against the Indianapolis Colts run stop defense. Our number 12 to close out the RB1 conversation is Raheem Mostert. Raheem Mostert, back-to-back games of 20-plus rushing attempts. What more can we ask for? He's coming off a huge performance in which he had 94 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. Touchdown upside is always going to be there when you're associated with one of the best offenses in the National Football League, and especially considering they're taking on the Washington Commanders this week, I'm expecting Raheem Mostert to be a solid play. Obviously, many of us are wondering whether or not Devon Achane is going to potentially be available. Prior to Friday's game of last week, Devon Achane had 3 consecutive limited participations at practice. So my expectation is that Devon Achane will be present and active going into this week's game. If in fact that does take place, I'm still expecting Raheem Mostert to be the lead back and be given the vast majority of overall touches, considering, of course, Devon Achane is not only coming off of the IR stint, but now this new injury that has, of course, plagued him as of late. Moving on to our number 13. We have Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs played 71% of the snaps, had himself 11 rushing attempts for 54 rushing yards, great, 8 targets, 4 receptions, 19 receiving yards. Had himself 15 overall touches and had himself 19 overall opportunities. We cannot complain with that. even though he only got himself 9.3 fantasy points, a negative game script is always going to lend to Jahmyr Gibbs having the opportunity of receiving upside, having the opportunity of being in the game when they're down in the red zone, and David Montgomery, kind of getting a touchdown yoinked from his overall scoreline. But this last week, unfortunately, wasn't able to find the end zone, wasn't able to find that overall upside, but that's just the nature of the game. It's going to happen. Nonetheless, we're going to continue to trust in Jahmyr Gibbs being a fantastic option for fantasy purposes. They do take on the New Orleans Saints. Like I mentioned with David Montgomery, the Saints are allowing 4.5 yards per carry and nearly 15 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I expect both these running backs to continue to find success in a positive game script in which they'll be running the ball for a majority of this game. Moving on to our 14, we have Rhamondre Stevenson. Rhamondre Stevenson is the only shining light within this offense. In 3 consecutive games, has been able to surpass over 85 rushing yards. Continues to get himself utilization as a receiver, had himself 5 receptions on 5 targets. And unfortunately, 2 of those overall receptions led to, negative 6 yards on each of their overall receptions. Couple screen passes that got sniffed out. Nonetheless, the opportunity is there for Rhamondre Stevenson. He takes on the Los Angeles Chargers, who has been pretty stout in terms of stopping the run as of late. But with Demario Douglas dealing with a concussion, there is a higher likelihood for Rhamondre Stevenson to be a security blanket for Mac Jones, Bailey Zappi, whoever ends up being the starting quarterback this week. But as long as they continue to give him a high volume of touches, again, coming off a week in which he had 26 total touches, he's absolutely going to be fantasy relevant. Our number 15 is Isiah Pacheco. Even though Isiah Pacheco didn't have any explosive runs, 15 carries for 55 yards, he was given opportunity in the red zone. And that's all you can ask for. In terms of the 4 overall trips within the red zone for the Kansas City Chiefs, 2 of them led to an Isiah Pacheco, rushing touchdown. The other one led to a Justin Watson overall receiving touchdown. Nonetheless, my expectation going into this week with Jerick McKinnon absent last week, Kadarius Toney absent last week, McCole Hardman absent last week. If these injuries are going to continue to plague this offense, they're going to have to continue to lean upon the running game with Isiah Pacheco, not only being the primary runner, but also getting himself involved within the receiving game. 5 targets, 5 catches, 34 receiving yards on Sunday's game. Taking on the Green Bay Packers, the 11th best matchup at the position. I'm expecting a lot of success this week. Our number 16 is Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren, there was a report on Sunday morning that many of you guys were relaying to me throughout our Sunday morning live stream from 7 to 10 a.m. every single Sunday morning. Be sure to swing on by for updated rankings. But many of you guys were relaying a report that said that George Pickens and, of course, Jaylen Warren were going to get more touches. And I explained to you guys, hey, listen, even though they're going to get more touches, Najee Harris is still the starter. And I gave the example of last week, he had 9 total rushing attempts. How much more can he be given this week? Well, he had himself 13 rushing attempts for 49 yards, 3 receptions for 13 receiving yards. Overall, 16 touches we cannot complain with, especially considering he's sharing the backfield with Najee Harris, who had himself 15 rushing attempts. Overall, this volume of opportunity, if it continues to stay persistent, especially going into this week, taking on the Arizona Cardinals, the most advantageous matchup at the running back position, I would anticipate that Jaylen Warren should have himself a lot of success and hopefully would be the one that finds the end zone this week. There have been games over the course of the last month where one way it goes towards Jaylen Warren scoring the touchdown, the other way it goes towards Najee Harris. That is the biggest determining factor for success within this backfield because both of them are getting opportunity. Both of them have looked better, especially this last week, and it's just a matter of can he find the end zone. I do know that Jaylen Warren is going to get himself far more receiving upside. All we got to hope for is that maybe Jaylen Warren gets himself a couple of screen passes like Kyren Williams did and finds himself in the end zone. Our number 17 is DeAndre Swift. He takes on the San Francisco 49ers run-stop defense. Now, luckily for DeAndre Swift, the opportunity continues to stay consistent. This is 10 consecutive games of 15 or more touches within this backfield. Can't ask for anything more. Amongst his entire career, he has already hit a career high in terms of season rushing attempts and rushing yards. Obviously, DeAndre Swift is a huge addition to this offense, but unfortunately, there have been many of circumstances in which, a rushing touchdown here or there gets taken away from him and goes in the direction of Jalen Hurts. It happened once again this Sunday against the Buffalo Bills, 1 yard line, brotherly shove into the end zone. It is what it is. Nonetheless, as long as those touchdowns are kind of in flux for DeAndre Swift, he's going to get his yardage. He's going to have himself a pretty solid week. But rushing touchdown upside, not as solidified within this offense, especially taking on the San Francisco 49ers defense. Moving on to our number 18, we have Najee Harris. Again, this is the most advantageous matchup at the running back position. The Arizona Cardinals have been getting torched by running backs. Kyren Williams finished as the number 1 overall running back last week. And even a guy like Royce Freeman had himself a touchdown and a high volume of overall opportunity and was extremely efficient with those touches. So why not Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren having themselves great overall performances? Again, he's coming off a week in which he had 99 rushing yards. That's a season high thus far this season. Of course, in the absence of Matt Canada, of course, this offense is significantly better. They surpassed 400 total yards as an offense, which I believe was the first time they did that this season. Going forward, as long as he continues to mainstay as the RB1 of this team, the primary goal line back, Najee Harris should be a value. And I'm going to guess he probably outperforms the number 18 overall ranking going into this week. Moving on to our number 19, we have Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary, from weeks 10 through 11, in the absence of Dameon Pierce, 52 rushing attempts, 262 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 5.04 yards per carry on average. Now, this last week took on the Jacksonville Jaguars, didn't have a high volume of overall opportunity in terms of rushing, only had himself 6 rushing attempts for 18 rushing yards, but at least was playing the most offensive snaps amongst the 2 running backs, played 82% of the offensive snaps. Clearly, he's the RB1, and had himself 7 targets, 6 catches, 54 receiving yards in order to save his day. Had an opportunity to score a touchdown later on within one of those drives in which he had a reception that took him down into the red zone, but unfortunately, wasn't given the nod in terms of scoring a touchdown. Nonetheless, they take on the Denver Broncos, the 13th best matchup at the position. Since week 5, the Denver Broncos are allowing 5.73 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. I do anticipate to see more utilization from Dameon Pierce going forward. Obviously, now that he's kind of found his footing coming back from the injury. But nonetheless, I do anticipate that Devin Singletary will maintain the RB1 role within the Texans offense. On number 20, is Breece Hall. The problem that I have with Breece Hall primarily isn't that he's getting himself a lot of receiving upside, because the receiving upside he's been able to garner is unbelievable. From week 6 through 12, he's got himself 36 targets, 30 receptions, 261 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. He's averaging 5 receptions per game. In a full PPR scoring format, that's fantastic. In a half PPR, obviously, there's a downtick in terms of overall performance. Over the course of the last 4 games, 3 of those performances are less than 10 fantasy points, because primarily his rushing upside isn't there. And considering they're taking on Atlanta, it doesn't bode well for him this week. When we just look at weeks 6 through 12 in terms of rushing statistics from Breece Hall, he has accumulated 39, 17, 50, 28, 23, and 25 rushing yards in these games. Of course, not a lot of opportunity, but even in the games in which he's given ample opportunity, not very efficient considering this offensive line is dealing with a lot of injuries and just isn't playing well. When you're taking on Tim Boyle on a weekly basis, stack the box and make him win the game with his arm, which of course he's not capable of doing. That's why we have Breece Hall in this position. Moving on to our number 21, we have Bijan Robinson Jr. Bijan Robinson Jr., in the absence of Antonio Gibson, was such a better fantasy prospect because of that receiving upside. Obviously, this last week only had 3 targets, 2 receptions, 11 receiving yards. Didn't have as much upside within that overall category because Antonio Gibson was back from injury. But nonetheless, there was an opportunity for Bijan Robinson Jr. to score a touchdown on Sunday. Unfortunately, this offense ran a little bit of that speed option to the outside, and instead of pitching it off to Bijan Robinson, who would have easily scored a touchdown, Sam Howell kept the ball, scored a rushing touchdown against the Dallas Cowboys defense. There's always going to be potential for him to find the end zone. This week they take on the Miami Dolphins. My only concern taking on the Miami Dolphins is if in fact the Dolphins take a very early lead in this game, could it diminish the volume of opportunity that Bijan Robinson gets within his overall rushing statistics? If that takes place and he's not going to get a boost in terms of his receiving upside like last week against the Dallas Cowboys, that is very concerning. That's the only thing that worries me going into a negative potential game script against the Miami Dolphins. Other than that, he's getting himself, 17 touches last week, typically getting himself a high volume of opportunity. Really can't complain within that overall scenario. Our number 22 is Jerome Ford. Jerome Ford, the primary number 1 of this team, had himself 9 carries for 65 yards against the Denver Broncos defense. Again, an advantageous matchup, but when you have DTR as your starting quarterback, and then of course they're bringing in a guy like PJ Walker in the absence of DTR who got himself in concussion protocol, it is very difficult to trust that this offense can score. And if in fact they are going to score, it's purely going to be on the backs of that offensive line, allowing Jerome Ford to get down into that scenario and be able to plunge in for a touchdown. Unfortunately, this last week, the goal line carries were still given to Kareem Hunt. So as long as that's going to be the scenario, and this is the entire situation where, sure, he's going to get himself more opportunity, but down near the goal line, he's not going to have himself a lot of touches. Unless Joe Flacco is going to be the starting quarterback, it is very difficult for me to see him anywhere higher than a low-end RB2 going into this week within the matchup against the LA Rams. Number 23 is Javonte Williams. The issue that I have with Javonte Williams is one that I share with, Jerome Ford. The issue is the other running backs in this backfield taking away, the most valuable touches near the goal line. Samaje Perine scored a rushing touchdown. Russell Wilson had a read option that kept, and he ended up scoring a rushing touchdown against the Cleveland Browns defense. These are very unfortunate scenarios, but that has taken place over the course of the last couple weeks here. Even though Javonte Williams has found the end zone within the receiving game, unless he's scoring rushing touchdowns, his overall upside is definitely capped. Going into this week, taking on the Houston Texans. Again, they are playing extremely well in terms of stopping the run in comparison to the season past. And even though we know that Javonte Williams is going to get touches, I mean, from week 7 through 12, he's dominated the rushing attempts. 75% of the rushing attempts out of this backfield for running backs have gone in the direction of Javonte Williams. 40% of the targets and 54% of the fantasy points. The reason why the fantasy point total is so low is because he's not getting enough receptions and not scoring the touchdowns that are free, that are unfortunately going to the other players. Our number 24 is Achane. There is a potential in which he can return, and if in fact he returns and is given very similar workload in which Jeff Wilson saw last week, Jeff Wilson had 14 touches on 33% of the offensive snaps. If we can get 10 plus touches for Achane, considering how efficient he has been this season, and hopefully this injury isn't going to impede his overall potential for success, I would anticipate that Achane with 10 touches could very easily be an RB2 prospect going into this week. Number 25, we have A.J. Dillon. My expectation is that Aaron Jones will miss another consecutive week. If in fact he is active on Sunday, he will be on screen within our live stream from Sunday, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. Be sure to go ahead and swing on by for updated rankings. But until then, I'm anticipating that A.J. Dillon will be the lone back in this backfield. In the last 4 games in which A.J. Dillon has played without Aaron Jones, averaging 15 carries, 52 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown in 4 games, 1 reception, 1.25 targets, 12 receiving yards, and 8.33 fantasy points per game. They take on the Chiefs that are allowing literally 4.94 yards per carry to opposing running backs. But if in fact this game gets out of hand, or potentially it's a negative game script, of course A.J. Dillon won't be utilized very much on the ground, and the rushing upside not being there isn't much of a surprise considering this offense truly has been airing it out over the course of this entire season. My expectation, he's on the fringe. If he falls into the end zone, he's an RB2. Outside of that, the opportunity is good enough to get him into this, higher tier RB3 conversation. Moving on to our number 26, Zach Charbonnet. We were given word earlier today that Kenneth Walker did not participate. Obviously, on a Tuesday, they have to determine whether they would participate, considering they have a Thursday game. On another short week, technically, even though they played last Thursday, I would anticipate that Kenneth Walker is going to be inactive. If he's active, of course, we may end up playing him, but if Zach Charbonnet is going to be the lone back coming off a week in which he played 88% of the offensive snaps, had 18 overall touches against the San Francisco 49ers, obviously not an easy matchup. And considering they take on the Dallas Cowboys this week, a team that since the bye week has put up, 43, 23, 49, 33, and 45 points as a team, this may be a negative game script. And if that's going to take place, luckily for many of us, Zach Charbonnet is definitely a capable receiving back coming off a week in which he had 4 targets, 4 catches. If those numbers continue to trickle in, for fantasy purposes, half PPR, full PPR, should be a solid RB3 option. Number 27, we have Chuba Hubbard. Of course, yesterday we heard that Frank Reich, their head coach, their quarterbacks coach, Josh McCown, and we also had their running backs coach, Deuce Staley, all fired and relieved of their jobs. Now, the thing with Chuba Hubbard is that even though you move away from these coaches, it's not going to change his scheme. He's going to continue to be the number 1 RB of this team, and they do have a very difficult matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We just have to hope that they utilize Chuba Hubbard in efficient manners. I mean, again, 5 catches for 47 yards on Sunday. If we can get that every single week, fantastic. I mean, he has had himself 2+ receptions in 9 of the last 11 games he's played for the Carolina Panthers. I would hope that they'd continue to accentuate his overall receiving upside, especially in a negative game script for majority of the season. On top of the fact that he's getting himself the rushing, total of 14 rushing attempts, only 45 rushing yards, but had himself the rushing touchdown. As long as the opportunity is there, he's a solid play. Moving on to our number 28, we have James Conner. James Conner, unfortunately, in that game, in the first drive for the Arizona Cardinals, had 5 total touches. For the remainder of the game, had 5 total touches. Had 10 total touches within the given week. Only had himself 4 receptions for 5 receiving yards. Really was shut down for majority of the game. As much as I'd like to trust James Conner, it is very difficult, especially considering this offense has not played well as of late. They take on the Pittsburgh Steelers this week. Since Cameron Hayward, one of their primary starting defensive tackles and leaders, has returned, this defense is only allowing 3.66 yards per carry and only 10 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. That's enough for James Conner. We just need him to find the end zone. Outside of that, it's very difficult for us to expect upside out of James Conner. Moving to number 29, we have Joe Mixon. Again, like I mentioned earlier in regards to matchups, they do take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's the worst matchup. They're allowing 3.38 yards per carry and only 6 fantasy points per game since week 5. 2 opposing running backs. Joe Mixon is the lone running back, the only one that is getting touches in this backfield. And all the Jacksonville Jaguars need to do is stack the box and, of course, force someone like Jake Browning to throw and try to beat them with his arm. He's probably not going to be capable of doing so. Therefore, I expect Joe Mixon and his overall upside to be diminished based on the overall fact that Joe Burrow is absent. On number 30, we have Tyler Allgeier. Tyler Allgeier, in the course of the last couple games, has seen himself less and less opportunity. Now, it isn't because Bijan Robinson is getting himself more touches. Like I mentioned earlier with Bijan Robinson, who's in the S tier, from weeks 8 and 9 was getting himself 22 total rushing attempts. Weeks 10 and 12 had himself 38 rushing attempts, a huge uptick. But the overall opportunity for Tyler Allgeier is pretty much being capped off by a guy like Cordero Patterson. Cordero Patterson had himself 8 rushing attempts on Sunday's game against the New Orleans Saints. If that's going to continue to be the case, Tyler Allgeier, less of a valuable option, but still had himself 10 carries for 64 rushing yards against the Jets, could be a value considering the Jets can't really stop the run this season. At number 31, Royce Freeman. Like I mentioned earlier, the Cleveland Browns secondary have allowed the fewest passing yards per game on average to opposing teams this season. So if in fact it's going to continue to be the case, the Los Angeles Rams are most likely going to lean upon the running game. And in order to keep Kyren Williams protected, healthy, it is necessary to have a second running back within this rotation in order to alleviate him in some of those scenarios in which, of course, he's getting too many touches, like earlier this season, which of course wore him down to then sending him to the injured reserve. So hopefully, Royce Freeman is going to get himself opportunities, had himself 13 carries for 77 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown on Sunday, and 34% of his offensive snaps. Obviously, a lot of those late in the game, but nonetheless, if we're going to continue to see him get a fair share of opportunity, should be a solid fantasy option. Number 32 is Kareem Hunt. In any given circumstance, Kareem Hunt can very easily score himself a touchdown. Like I mentioned with Jerome Ford, last week, Kareem Hunt in the red zone near the goal line had himself a rushing attempt. Wasn't able to find himself in the end zone, but nonetheless, the opportunity is there. As long as the opportunity is present, he could very easily go from 4 to 6 points every week to 10 to 12 points every single week in a half PPR scoring format. So hopefully, if he scores a touchdown, for many of us who are dealing with a lot of bye weeks, he can end up being a far better performer than number 32. Number 33 is Samaje Perine. Now, Samaje Perine over the course of the last couple weeks has seen himself far more utilization. He has taken over the role of Jaleel McLaughlin. In the last 2 games, 10.2 and 13.1 fantasy points. He's been able to score himself a touchdown last week, 7 carries, 55 yards, and a touchdown. The week prior had himself 7 receptions. Regardless of whether it is on the ground, through the air, no matter what the game script is, he is going to be an active member within this offense behind Javonte Williams. And if in fact Javonte Williams isn't going to get every single rushing touchdown upside opportunity, then of course Samaje Perine is in line for the potential of scoring some fantasy points. Our number 34 is Antonio Gibson. Antonio Gibson, prior to his injury, had himself a consecutive streak of games in which he was getting himself 5+ receptions. This last week, only had himself 9 total touches, 6 on the ground and 3 through the air. Now that they take on the Miami Dolphins, I would anticipate his overall receiving workload to be increased. And if that's going to take place, there's always the potential of getting yourself 6 catches for 60 yards or maybe even finding himself in the end zone in one of those scenarios, which of course gives him value. Moving on to our number 35, we have Dameon Pierce. I don't know exactly how they want to use Dameon Pierce. He only had 6 touches and only played 18% of the snaps on Sunday against Jacksonville. But if in fact Devin Singletary is going to continue to maintain as the RB1, having played 81% of the snaps last week, not only as a receiving threat, but also as a pass blocking threat, Devin Singletary was able to get the job done. Assuming they continue to lean towards Devin Singletary, Dameon Pierce has the potential considering the advantageous matchup, but we got to remember this is a pass-first team, and they want to throw the ball to Tank Dell and Nico Collins, Dalton Schultz. They'll continue to lean towards them prior to getting to a guy like Dameon Pierce as their RB2. Moving on to our number 36, the final player I wanted to mention, we have Miles Sanders. Again, with the coaching change, I don't expect the overall workload of Miles Sanders to change, even though he was signed to a huge contract, and you would anticipate he would be the guy that is given majority of overall touches considering how much they're paying him. He still had himself 15 rushing attempts last week. Very inefficient with those touches, but as long as those opportunities continue to stay pat, should be a solid option for fantasy purposes going into this week with always having a chance of scoring a touchdown. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. That covers my week 13 running back rankings. If you enjoyed today's content, do me a solid, click the like button down below. Be sure to subscribe. Check out Underdog Fantasy if you want to stay up to date on my latest rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. Thank you, everybody. Tomorrow I'll be back with wide receiver rankings for week 13. Thursday, we'll have tight end and quarterback rankings. Friday, we'll have some hidden gems. All of that in line. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.